In 2023, I took you through the politics of Kyrgyzstan, which I dubbed functional random because the country doesn't follow any obvious pattern, not in politics and not in society. It just muddles through every issue while staying somewhat functional. Well, this is somewhat true about Cambodia as well. The kingdom doesn't follow any obvious pattern, at least not in society. The politics is autocratic but ineffective, so in the end the country muddles through every issue. Except it routinely doesn't stay functional. So, welcome to Dysfunctional Random. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the 5th featured installment of the Khmer series. Alright, so with the risk of getting myself on a sanctions list, this video is about how Cambodia works, or more precisely how it doesn't particularly work. No matter how this is phrased though, it's always bound to get some bad faith interpretation, because remarking that Cambodia is dysfunctional random carries an inherently negative connotation, even though it need not be the case necessarily. Still, the dysfunctional politics have certainly produced a series of outcomes that are neither here nor there. The political regime is de facto autocratic, but in a way it can always put a smile on your face. And these idiosyncrasies are, of course, the result of the kingdom's recent history. Just like many other places on Earth, the regime changed here at least 4 times in the last 70 years, so there's plenty of recent lessons that are self-contradictory and idiosyncratic, yet somehow all of them are included at once. The politics of the country is dominated by the Cambodian People's Party, which has been in power effectively since the de facto defeat of Pol Pot. In almost every public place, there's photos of the Prime Minister and the King. Yet the King's relevance is not equal to that of the Prime Minister. In fact, the King has no political power and the country remained a monarchy simply because it was a convenient way for the autocratic or William-named Cambodian People's Party to stay in power. Here's how it was described to me at the King's Palace.
From the Senate, the President from the National Assembly, the Prime Minister of Cambodia.
Yeah, so the presidents of the chambers of parliament, the prime ministers, and probably the Minister of Internal Affairs and a few other people.
Something like that, yeah. But just the king has no political power. yeah. And then also, there must be the blood of the king also. So they have 2 royal blood, Notre Dame blood and Caesar blood. Yeah, that can be king of Cambodia.
So it has to be from a certain family,
but not everyone can be kings.
Right.
But everyone can be prime minister. Yeah. So, but we vote every 5 years for the new government. That we follow the constitutions.
How many prime ministers did the country have since the fall of the
Since that was
since
around
79.
1979.
Yeah, since
just only 2.
Only 2.
Yeah, the Samdech Hun Sen and his son right now is the current prime minister.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, but we're not allowed to share much, sorry, because in our constitution they can be prime minister for 2 times only.
2 terms.
Yeah, 10 years only. Yeah. But we don't say much. Sorry.
Right.
Yeah, you might understand that we're not allowed to share about the politics, sorry.
Fair enough.
Even we are a democracy country.
Fair enough.
Sorry. Is it the same like in Romania or
no? In Romania, the prime minister changes every 2 years, sometimes even.
It's really good to
since
change.
or more often. I mean, since 2020, this is the 5th prime minister.
Wow, 5th prime minister.
Yes.
Wow. We change them all the time.
Yeah, we change them all the
It's
time.
good for changing sometimes so that we
The
can
parliament
have develop.
the parliament fires the government.
Yeah, but
every
here
17
the
months or
thing
so.
is decided by parliaments. Yeah, but the one who have really power is the
executive.
Prime Minister.
Yeah, right. So there goes the answer on how it works. The Prime Minister calls the shots, the King is there for smiles and for show. But if you really want to get yourself into trouble, just ask insistently why does the king have no children or at least several wives, like it was the case with his father. I almost got kicked out from the palace for that. Lucky me, I didn't know then that His Royal Highness Norodom Seyhamoni is a dance instructor, is the only living royal figure on earth that speaks the Czech language, and his womanizer father said that his son's affection for women is akin to that of, quote, as his sisters, and that, quote, he dares not to make a deep relationship, unquote. If I had known that while videotaping these images, I would have stood a great chance of meeting the Cambodian lèse-majesté jurisprudence. You see, unlike neighboring Thailand, Cambodia doesn't have a lèse-majesté law per se, but that doesn't mean pointing out the very strong possibility that the head of state is a homosexual can remain unpunished. And this is what I mean by dysfunctional random. It's an autocracy, but with a smiley face, and the punishments are routinely straight out of a satire cartoon. Like, check out from the Khmer Times. Students re-educated after trampling on real banknotes. A group of schoolgirls have been firmly re-educated after they were caught disrespecting the Kingdom of Cambodia by stamping on real banknotes. They were caught performing their disrespectful act on January the 5th, 2024, and were immediately summoned by the authorities along with their parents. The rebellious youths were instructed in the mode of proper respect for symbols of Cambodia and then sent home after being made to sign a contract guaranteeing future behavior. These kinds of stories are very common. The actual punishment is routinely a strongly worded letter, but the authoritarian, or really Karen busybody instinct is in every corner of the state. Or take this one: Phnom Penh wizard told to stop sharing social media videos. Mr. Rem agreed to sign a contract with the director of the Department of Cult and Religion of Phnom Penh to stop posting videos of activities that affect the moral, social order, and religious beliefs online. The warlock also signed a contract that if he continues to post these pictures, he's willing to take responsibility before the law, unquote. It's really hard not to call the politics and governance of this place dysfunctional random. Although it has some positives too. State apparatchiks, including members of the military, are punished more severely for the crime of posting undignified videos on TikTok, and almost anything other than official statements qualify as undignified. Quite frankly, that's a standard we should adopt in Europe too, but that's a story for another day. So, while the monarchy is pretty much for show, the reason it's still there is interesting in its own right. You see, although the Pol Pot regime was overthrown in 1979, the international recognition of this reality took another 11 years to happen. The current king's father, Norodom Sihanouk, was kinda at fault for this. Norodom Sihanouk lived a very long life and served as head of state multiple times. From 1941 to 1955, then he abdicated so he could participate in politics, and as prime minister he instituted a totalitarian regime. Then, when his father died, he sort of abolished the monarchy and appointed himself as chief of state in 1960. Then he got ousted in a coup in 1970, and from exile he supported the Khmer Rouge, the commies that is. And he supported them from North Korea, where his son, the current king, was studying filmmaking at the National Academy of Cinematography in Pyongyang, alongside another film enthusiast, one named Kim Jong-il. The Cambodian Civil War happened, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge end up in power, more on that in the next episode, and His Majesty comes back to serve as a head of state. But only until 1979, when the Pol Pot regime is ousted by the Vietnamese army. The Vietnamese place him under house arrest initially, but then let him go under the condition that he leaves the country. And so he did, but he was still the internationally recognized head of state, so this pro-commie chap kept Cambodia's seat at the UN, thus preventing the normalization of post-communism for another decade. It's hard to overstate just how much harm the father of the current king did to Cambodia, and the only thing that got him back to the negotiation table was the fall of the USSR and the events in Tiananmen. Although not directly dependent on the USSR, the father king was living mostly in North Korea, which by late 1980s was facing mass famine and a whole plethora of unpleasant issues not exactly conducive to the life of a foreign king, events known in North Korean historiography as the Arduous March. So in that context, Narodom Sihanouk was willing to negotiate the end of hostilities between the Vietnam-supported People's Republic of Kampuchea and his exile-based organization, the Coalition Government of Democratic Kampuchea. The rapid fall of the communist world, as it was known, sped up this process. Still, one of the conditions was to keep the monarchy with himself as the king. Long story short, this was granted in exchange for his successor to be selected through a process independent of him, and a process that includes people who may not like him politically. Part of the agreement was also that his sons could be in politics, but that wasn't observed for too long because this ambitious young man, Prime Minister Hun Sen, had other ideas. Anyway, Norodom Sihanouk remained king until 2004 when, at age 82, abdicated for health reasons. He died in Beijing at age 90. And since 2004, the throne has been occupied by Norodom Seihamoni, this dance instructor and Czech-speaking bachelor, who just happened to be the quietest and least bothersome son of the king. It also helped a lot that he didn't want to be king, which is exactly what Prime Minister Hun Sen was looking for. So that's the shortest way of explaining why the monarchy still exists. Of course, this is not the explanation provided to you when you visit this place. In fact, the official tour of this place is quite funny because it really doesn't matter what questions you ask because all of them are going to be politically incorrect. If you ask about Pol Pot, then suddenly the piety of the institution of the king goes out on the window, given that the de facto founder of the modern state was a big fan of Pol Pot. So much so that he was willing to keep the country in international isolation 11 years after Pol Pot lost, just so he won't have to admit that he was wrong. But the more interesting part of Cambodian politics is the prime minister. As you've heard the lady say in the short clip earlier, there have only really been just two prime ministers since the fall of communism. The ambitious Hun Sen until 2023 and his son Hun Manet, who had just been sworn into office when I was videotaping these images. Now, earlier I have called the father of the current king the de facto founder of the modern state. Well, in the same vein, Hun Sen is the de facto founder of post-communist Cambodian politics. Think Sasha Lukashenko or Nursultan Nazarbayev. Well, kinda, but with characteristics specific to this region. The story of Hun Sen is the kind of political story that accidentally ended up being unique. There aren't that many leaders in history who survived long enough to preside over the creation of a special tribunal to convict the criminals in the regime he started in. But that's basically Hun Sen. He joined the Khmer Rouge in 1970 at age 18, defected to the Vietnamese at age 25, helped the Vietnamese win the war against the Khmer Rouge, and then climbed the ranks of post-war politics to remain prime minister for almost 40 years. At age 26, he became the youngest Minister of Foreign Affairs in all of global history, a position he held from 1979 until 1990. In the meantime, he also held the office of Prime Minister from 1985 until the first free elections in 1993, which he lost. So as a result, he joined the coalition and started working on improving his politics to win the next election. No, I'm just kidding. No. He staged a coup d'etat in 1997 and installed a de facto one-party state with himself as the prime minister that never lost the elections ever since. In 2013, it almost seemed like the opposition might beat him, but it didn't happen. To make sure that won't ever happen, in 2018, the Supreme Court dissolved the main opposition party, and the Cambodian People's Party won 100% of the seats in the parliament. Even Lukashenko or Nazarbayev would allow some token opposition to have seats in the parliament, but not this guy. After the conclusion of the Special Tribunal for Khmer Rouge crimes, again more on that in the next episode, Mr. Hun Sen finally resigned from power in favor of his son. and in 2024 he was appointed the President of the Senate. So if we count his political career from 1977, in almost 50 years of politics, Mr. Hun Sen was a prominent communist, a Marxist-Leninist, a state capitalist, and now a national conservative. Even his fans admit he doesn't actually believe in anything other than power. During the height of the migrant crisis in Australia in 2014, the Australian newspapers described Mr. Hun Sen as a, quote, wily operator who destroys his political opponents, unquote, which is fair. So, with these kinds of politics, Cambodia is a very orderly autocracy or quasi-dictatorship in which everyone serves the government or else, right? Well, no. This is where the dysfunctional random part comes in. You see, the regime might want that, but the reason Mr. Hun Sen survived that long in power was because he figured it out somewhere along the way that the Khmer people don't function like that. In the previous episode, I showed an extreme example, but while not everyone is willing to live in a floating village, that kind of spirit is noticeable every step of the way in Cambodia. And it's all underpinned by dollarization. Cambodia remains Asia's most dollarized economy to this day. 14 years ago, the International Monetary Fund was writing policy papers on this being a problem and was advising the Hun Sen regime on how to solve it. Needless to say, none of that worked. And the reason it didn't work is because unlike other places like El Salvador or Ecuador, Cambodia became dollarized as a result of the people's will. Most people despised the government so much that they refused to trust it ever again. This isn't necessarily the fault of the current regime. This started in the 1980s, when most people alive today in Cambodia weren't even born yet. You see, the Pol Pot regime didn't just deport intellectuals to work the fields. They quite literally bombarded the central bank to the ground, and all trade was now in barter. When the Pol Pot regime was defeated, the central bank was reinstalled, but a regime of centrally planned economy also remained, which didn't exactly act as a confidence booster for the survivors of the Pol Pot regime, who not only saw all of their savings destroyed by Pol Pot, but were now witnessing a regime that refused to allow them to accumulate wealth. So they started trading in Thai baht, US dollars, and to a lesser extent Vietnamese dong, and saved up in gold and $100 bills. When the king came back in 1990 as a result of the negotiations that I mentioned earlier, the country was ruled by something called the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia, a special body meant to manage the transition to democracy. Well, it eventually failed at that task, but it did succeed in something positive, albeit unintended. The UNTAC was one of the largest and most expensive operations in UN history, at a cost of $1.7 billion, which is about $4 billion in today's money. A lot of that money necessarily had to flow through regular people because nobody wanted to emigrate to Cambodia to work, so the UN bureaucrats, whether they liked it or not, had to make do with the local workforce. But this also meant that US dollars flooded the economy itself, creating a new shock against the national currency, a shock which the Cambodian central bank was not prepared to cope with. Also, at the time, there was only one trustworthy commercial bank, a joint venture with a Thai conglomerate, and that bank ended up handling almost all of the UN operations, which ended up holding a fast-growing foreign currency deposits. The people liked this because not only they weren't big fans of the local government, but also because the local government couldn't tax US dollar transactions. So everyone, rich and poor, got into the habit of using the dollar by 1993 at the latest. Again, all of this happened before most people alive today in Cambodia were born. The median age in Cambodia is just 26 years old, or 25.1 years old, depending on which study you trust. Of course, by spontaneously choosing to use US dollars, which couldn't be taxed, this sent the Khmer Real into a hyperinflationary spiral, very similar to post-communist countries in Eastern Europe, where triple-digit inflation was also common. The reason was also the same. The government needed finance, the rates for foreign loans were too high, and the plebs didn't trust the local currency. Except in Cambodia, that mistrust stuck permanently. As time went on, the situation kinda improved, but the real was never fully adopted by the populace. Quoting in US dollars is the absolute norm on all levels, from the tuk-tuk drivers and all the way up to state institutions. After trying to fight it for over 20 years, the state quietly dropped its efforts at de-dollarization and simply legalized the de facto situation, one in which constant switch between the real and the US dollar is no big deal. ATM machines that dispense US dollars also popped up all over the place, and of course, unlike the 1980s, transactions in US dollars are now also taxed. But since it's this region, this also brought in fake banknotes, which in turn created the situations that put a strain on my mental health. It's very common to have a brand new dollar bill simply be rejected because of a bent corner or some other totally random reason. So do keep that in mind should you ever visit this place. Have a lot of new $5 and $10 banknotes held in a very nice envelope. Digital payments are very rare and strongly discouraged by the high fees and by the vendors themselves, who really like the rapid economic growth of the last decade and don't particularly feel like sharing it with Hun Sen and his son. The dollarization episode in Cambodia is a very profound lesson of just how important money is, specifically how important it is to have options when it comes to money. Libertarians are directionally correct when they yap about government money, but in practice, Cambodia and Zimbabwe and Ecuador and Lebanon and El Salvador and quite a few other places, these prove that you don't need a Bitcoin revolution or some autistic tech thingy to go around an untrustworthy government whose policies you despise. It turns out the US dollar can be good enough. Also, the Cambodians' insistence on using the US dollar and to a lesser extent the Thai baht, but not the Chinese yuan, tells us a thing or two about that de-dollarization thingy that the CCP or BRICS propagandists keep talking about since 2012 or so. And the reason I mention this, in addition to taking a jab at the CCP, is because the people's insistence on using the US dollar ended up curbing the geopolitical ambitions of the regime, much to the desperation of the political class. You see, in theory, Cambodia is a neutral country by constitution, part of the UN Transitional Authority Agreement. The regime would have wanted the geopolitics of the country to trend pro-Chinese, but the people's insistence on the US dollar ended up moving the geopolitics of the country de facto in a pro-Western direction, in a dysfunctional random kind of way, and with Vietnam as the proxy. And Vietnam moved pro-Western also by proxy in a never-ending bid not to be China. This state of affairs also incidentally blows out of the water the entire body of academic literature on decolonization in the global south. Okay, maybe not all of it, but certainly most of the Westoid takes on decolonization simply do not apply to Indochina. And over the long run, this could become a problem, because the geopolitics of a country is not just economic and military deals, it's also affinity. And one thing we've been covering quite consistently over the last decade here on the sofa is that the increasingly insane left-wing nonsense coming out from Western institutions is slowly eroding the affinity with large swaths of the rest of the world, including places that are Western-friendly by default, places such as Cambodia. Since the formal re-establishment of the kingdom in 1993, the de facto pro-Western geopolitics of the country was uncontested. It all started to slowly change in 2014, and not because of China, but precisely because of some Western countries, particularly European ones. Cambodia's de facto dictator ended up working pretty well with the conservative Tony Abbott administration in Australia on curbing mass immigration, even if they didn't particularly like the colorful descriptions used in the Australian media about the Phnom Penh regime. However, work with Europe turned out to be harder. When the Cambodian administration tried to be more pro-migration in line with Europe's openness to migration, the same European countries that were willing to let in 2 million unvetted fighting-age men were suddenly not so keen on 10,000 well-vetted Cambodians. Then, closer to present day, the opposite is happening. Now Europe would want more migration from this region, but now the region is less willing to be open because the current rapid economic growth requires a lot of workforce and they'd rather keep their own than having to import it from China or other places. This is specifically true here in Cambodia, where immigration from China has been the main source of violent crime. If you spend enough time on Khmer news spaces, you can easily figure out the ethnicity of criminals by the headlines. Just like in Britain, where an immigrant from Pakistan is Asian, well, a similar phenomenon is happening here as well. Almost all foreign criminals are named by nationality, with the exception of the Chinese, who are almost always called foreigners in news headlines. The reason I'm mentioning this is to show just how many facets of the local trends follow the Western ones rather than the Chinese ones. And again, it's not the political regime that wants this. Quite the opposite, the political regime would want more openness with China and, more recently, with Russia. Now, to be totally fair, there is one specific area where cooperation with Russia really does make sense here, namely the demining efforts. At the end of the war with the Pol Pot regime, Cambodia was the biggest minefield in the world, literally. An aspect which prevented Cambodia's development for decades. Things have been improving lately with new demining techniques which involve these cute little rats and establishing perimeters. I took extensive notes of the process because we will need this in Ukraine as well at some point in the future. So, Russia has been providing technical expertise with this because a huge chunk of the mines used by the Khmer Rouge were of Soviet origin. But the regime here wanted even more collaboration with Russia besides this self-evidently useful humanitarian issue. As I was taping these images, a Russian anti-submarine naval vessel docked in Sihanoukville. Officially, it was dressed as a technical visit given that a lot of Cambodia's small fleet is also of Soviet origin. But as it's customary with Russia, a technical visit is rarely just that. Oh, what's this? A Russian tycoon is being held in prison since 2015 on acts of violence in Cambodia, and by pure coincidence, the victims withdrew their charges just before this technical visit? Now, I'll leave in the description multiple links if you want to go down the rabbit hole of the Sergei Polonsky scandal in Sihanoukville. But the point I'm making here is that the geopolitics of Cambodia are also subjected to the same dysfunctional random incentives as its economy. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. After all, as long as Cambodia is dollarized, fully integrated into the global supply chain, and with healthy demographics and rapid economic growth, these little Russian stunts every 5 or 6 years are unlikely to cause any problem. However, given China's export of crime here, I will say that the West is not doing enough to protect its interests in the region. Although we should be happy that nobody said that out loud in a diplomatic setting on why this is the case. Because the real reason, while in theory not a problem, would in fact be very badly perceived locally. The real reason being, of course, the fact that we regard Thailand and Vietnam as being more important. But, as mentioned in previous episodes, that's what the French thought too, which saw the whole region turn virulently against France because of this. So yeah, let's not make the same mistake again. So, to sum up, while the Pol Pot regime has been out of power for over 45 years and Pol Pot himself has been dead for almost 30 years, that history still has plenty of repercussions in the present, even if most of the people alive today were not even a theoretical thought in the 1980s at the initial post-Khmer Rouge aftermath. This presents a very good case study on historical inertia. It turns out that not even an almost full replacement of people can affect historical inertia too much. Almost nobody alive today knows why the US dollar is the de facto currency, but everyone knows it's a good idea. Nobody told them that. In fact, the government told them for 20 years that it's a terrible idea. Almost nobody alive today was around during the UNTAC times. But almost everyone alive instinctively favors the current geopolitical trajectory, even when the trade-offs are explained. And to make it even worse for social constructivists of all stripes, Cambodia is not unique in this. Vietnam functions very similarly. Myanmar functions similarly too. Then a military junta interrupted this for a while. But once that will be solved, and it will, I hope I'll be there to show you what, if anything, changed. And the reason I make the point about how all social constructivist stories come here to die is because the current arrangement also comes with a lot of issues, which I'll discuss in episode 10. And those issues, mainly the incredibly diverse criminal activity here, won't be addressed, let alone solved, by academic posturing about socioeconomics. So when that time comes, we'd better have a different idea by then. The current idea ensures relative stability and steady increase in prosperity, even if in ways that doesn't please bleeding-heart European social democrats. But finally closing the fight with the shadows of the past will require some new ideas. But that is a story for another time. Until then, in the next episode, we'll look in great detail at the Pol Pot regime, which, by the way, is also in a dysfunctional, random way. Most countries that have been through such a regime have either straight up denied its existence, like in China, or went to great lengths to preserve and enhance the memory of it, like all post-Soviet countries except Russia and Turkmenistan. Cambodia somehow did both. It went further than most post-Soviets by actually having an international tribunal about the whole ordeal, but also making it very difficult to study it physically, although with a few fascinating exceptions. All of that and much more in the next episode. Thank you all for watching, don't forget to subscribe, and if you really like this kind of content, please do consider becoming a member. It's how these efforts are supported. Currently, we're trying to reach Tajikistan. And with that, I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.